So I've been enjoying, Preet, all of your comments that I'm just a regular citizen now, I'm just an ordinary citizen, what a wonderful thing it is. But it's made me wonder that if you hadn't been fired by President Trump, what would your docket look like? What would you be doing right now if you continued to be the U.S. Attorney for this region?
I don't know if that's a roundabout way of trying to ask me about the cases I was investigating that I don't talk about.
Or what about the cases you wanted to do that you might not have gotten to?
I can't talk about that either.
You know?
Look, I think you would have seen the same diet of cases. I think, look, the office I come from is a storied institution, not unlike the Bar Association here. And even though I'm gone, and I'm sad to be not with all of my friends and colleagues in the Southern District of New York, the new U.S. Attorney, the acting U.S. Attorney June Kim, comes from the same tradition of excellence, independence, and good judgment. And so all the cases that I was working on and overseeing, wasn't doing them, other people were doing the cases, are the ones that June and his team are continuing to do. So I would imagine that if I were still the U.S. Attorney, things would look pretty much how they look now from this vantage point.
So let's go a little bit deeper in that. You know, some people consider you sort of the Elliot Ness of white-collar crime, you know, you've taken on a certain celebrity status as an attorney. Bob Mueller has taken on a kind of celebrity status of the moment of being someone. Everyone is very intrigued with how people like you do your jobs and how there are differences between leading prosecutors in the country. And I'm just interested without, you know, and I'm not trying to set you up here, but to look, as you watch what Mueller is doing, and I've heard your commentary about it, if you were the investigator of the potential that Russia had meddled and hacked into our democracy and messed with this institution, and whether or not there were prospects of collusion between the Trump campaign and others, what dimensions would you be bringing that maybe a Bob Mueller might not be bringing?
I don't know, and I wouldn't pretend to be bringing anything more to that endeavor and undertaking than Bob Mueller himself. I mean, Bob Mueller is, I think, one of the great American lawyers, prosecutors, investigators, members of the military. I mean, I think he's an American hero. And I know that there are a lot of people who want to undermine him and denigrate him, including, for example, Newt Gingrich, who on the day that, I like to point this out as often as I can, on the day that Bob Mueller was appointed special counsel, at that point, a lot of people, including folks like Newt Gingrich, said what they felt and meant it, that people should be calmer now and rest assured that you have a nonpartisan, intelligent, neutral, fair-minded person in charge of this investigation. And as soon as some headway started to get made and political considerations started to enter into things more than maybe before, now all of a sudden Bob Mueller is partisan. Bob Mueller is putting together a partisan team. Bob Mueller is out of control. Bob Mueller should be defunded. There's talk about whether or not it's okay for Bob Mueller to be fired directly or indirectly by the president. And I think that's terrible. So I'm not going to second guess what he's doing. I think we should all be patient and honor whatever he decides. You know, the other thing I'll say is there are lots and lots of people who don't like the president, and I get that. And there are lots of people who like the president. I get that less. But people are allowed to have their own independent political judgments, and I worry that people are substituting their political preferences for what law and justice compel or require.
Right.
And so I'd like people to say in advance, because I'm doing this, that whatever Bob Mueller decides to do, make a case, not make a case, refer a case higher up than he's gone so far, I'm going to respect that. Because I don't think anybody that's around would do it better. I mean, Bob Mueller should not be put on a pedestal. He's not God. He's not infallible. But I think he's as good as America has in the justice system. And everyone, Democrat, Republican, left, or right, however disappointed you might be because your political preference is not vindicated at the end of the day, should respect, acknowledge, and appreciate whatever result he comes up with.
Let's go into the environment of the White House for a minute. And I was reading an exchange apparently between Sally Yates and Don McGahn, where Don McGahn said, what should it matter if one White House official lies to another White House official? What does that say to you? Because when it comes to what you just talked to about law and framework, does Don McGahn have a point that we shouldn't be worried about that? Or is there a higher moral question about how those people in the White House are operating today that should concern us?
Look, I don't know if it's a moral question. and I leave to people in their conscience and religion whether or not they should lie to other people in their daily lives. I think there are two categories of thing. One is, does lying or obstruction or subterfuge or deceit break some law? And we've now seen that at least in two occasions, not only has there been an allegation of lying, George Papadopoulos and Michael Flynn, but guilty pleas to those things. So that's significant. That broke, went across the criminal line. And then second, with respect to whether or not we should be concerned that people are lying within the White House, separate and apart from the criminal issue and the morality issue, there's a competence issue. And lots of folks here are parts of organizations, most of you. Some of you run those organizations. And if you have your top deputies, whether it's a U.S. Attorney's Office, a union, a bar association, a law firm, a hedge fund, where they're lying to each other and not, rowing in the same direction and letting each other know with some transparency what they're about, that's a disaster. And separate and apart from having people who are on the right side of doing the right thing in the White House, you want to expect at least basic competence. And what I think you find in the execution of lots of things that people might not agree with, depending on what their politics are or their ideology may be, like the travel ban, for example. There are a lot of people who don't like the travel ban on decent, legal policy grounds, but it also happens to be the case that they're utterly incompetent in how that was rolled out. And that exacerbates the problem. So my worry about the lying to each other and the fact that someone like the White House counsel himself says who should care about that if he's not talking about the criminal aspect alone tells you how much dysfunction there is.
In your view, can President Trump obstruct justice?
Yeah, this idea, and by the way, there's another weird phenomenon going on among the president's lawyers. On one day, one lawyer says he cannot obstruct justice as a matter of law because he's the commander-in-chief and the president of the United States, a point that's been echoed over and over again by Alan Dershowitz, who was briefly my professor when I was in college, not law school. And then the next day, another one of his lawyers, Ty Cobb, says that's not the argument that we're going to be making. So A, I believe, I agree with Ty Cobb for various reasons we can get into or not. But B, it also tells you that, try not to be provocative, that there's some aspect of not being on the same page and arguably incompetence, even in the representation of the president on the most high-stakes legal matter we've had in the country in decades.
If you were going to be taking down a kind of big Wall Street financier who tweeted a lot, and this is a corrupt financier who had engaged in crimes of some sort, and you were chasing him, and there was one morning where something was tweeted and said, I fired so-and-so, or I did so-and-so, for X reasons, and that was sort of a new revelation. And I'm of course referring, a metaphor here for Donald Trump.
No.
Possibly tweeting that he had fired Flynn for lying in part to the FBI, which was something he did. And then now there's this sort of complicated orchestration that perhaps he didn't do it and that John Dowd, one of his attorneys, had done this. If that had happened in a case that you were dealing with a Wall Street financier where somebody said, no, that wasn't my tweet, even though there may have been 35,000 tweets and very hard to see that any others were of this magnitude were done by others, how would you manage that legally?
I think you would exploit it. As much as, reason would allow you to exploit it. Look, I don't put too much stock in the fact of that particular tweet, and not because it's now come out that John Dowd said, the president's lawyer, that he wrote the tweet or he drafted the tweet, and Kellyanne Conway swears that she was with the president the whole time, so she knows he couldn't have done the tweet. I don't really understand how all that works. What I do think I would do as a prosecutor is you look at all the statements made by the people that you're looking at, and they tell you something. And whether or not, as Donald Trump makes clear over and over and over again, he takes great umbrage at the idea that someone else is making decisions. The SNL skit, as far as I know, had some truth when they talked about how irksome it was to the president that Steve Bannon was sort of parading around like he was running things. And so by the president's own words, actions, and sometimes peevishness about how he is the one who's running the show and actually is the one, as we often know, is doing the literal tactile tweeting from his phone, the fact that someone else may have drafted it, he adopted it, so it's his view as well. At the end of the day, if it turns out it was mistaken, it wasn't the real reason, I think there's plenty of other things that you look at. But I think you put all of it together, all the tweets matter, because to the extent the president did write a tweet himself, it's a statement that goes to the state of mind of the person. But for this example with the lawyer, in some ways I think what the president fires off in a tweet is more probative and revelatory about his state of mind in most instances than some memo that gets, circulated, to the extent they still do memos in the White House, gets circulated among professionals and vetted and approved by 3 layers of lawyers, and that comes out. What the president says out of his own mouth when he appears on the White House lawn or in an interview with Lester Holt or anyone else, and what he tweets with his own fingers on his phone tell you something, and you would use them to prove whatever point you want to prove.
Just speculating for a minute, because I know that the country, and We Tonight and CNN and everyone is using you as the best lens that we have, the best tool we have to peel back the onion layers of this case and to understand things better. And I'm just interested, as you look at it, on a scale of 1 to 10 of seriousness for the White House, where would you put this?
Look, you've got a former national security advisor that you metaphorically hugged, hired over the objection of the prior administration, who had been fired by the prior administration, who had alarm bells basically around his neck for a period of time, then got upset when you were told that he had done bad things and had lied to the vice president, then took a long time to fire him, and then arguably, and I think the evidence bears this out, told your own FBI director, can you lay off on this guy who I hired and didn't want to fire? And then when that didn't happen, I'm not saying it directly as a result of this, but then when that didn't happen, you fired the FBI director, and you cringe and take great offense at the idea that anyone says anything bad about you or Michael Flynn. Just as one example, one sliver of a thing, whether or not, and people don't like it when I say this, whether or not there's going to be a higher criminal charge, the fact of that alone, I think, puts it at an 8 or 9. It's an incredibly significant thing that, separate and apart from legal jeopardy, makes it difficult for the president, even on his own terms. I mean, some people might like the fact that his agenda gets derailed, but if you're talking about how serious it is from the perspective of the White House itself, to be engulfed in this kind of scandal, and no longer, by the way, speculative, whether or not there are future charges that are going to drop, there are other shoes to drop with respect to Mike Flynn, and there may be. He's a convicted felon who is cooperating with the special counsel who was appointed by the president's own much-touted Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, which former FBI director was hailed in service for 10 years, and then at the end of his 10-year term, out of a country of 320 million people, not to tout Bob Mueller too much, Republicans and Democrats together decided we're not going to find someone else. We're going to change the law to allow this man to serve another 2 years. So you've got serious allegations. You have guilty plea to serious allegations. You have more shoes to drop. And all of that is being done and directed by a person who I believe is not as nonpartisan as they come, and if not nonpartisan, a Republican, and appointed mostly by Republicans during his long career in public service. Yeah, it's pretty serious.
So an 8 or a 9. God, I'd hate to see what a 10 is with you.
You never go 10. Not at the bar.
I was impressed. As I told you when we came up here, I've been listening to lots of your commentary, podcasts, reading things you've written, and I've sort of have Preet Bharara in my head instead of Christmas.
I'm very sorry about that.
Yeah, but I was very impressed. There's this one talk you did recently on a podcast I called My Glass Half Full, the Preet Glass Half Full, Half Empty commentary on Mike Flynn. And I was impressed that despite there being this clamor out there on Flynn and the pleading guilty for lying in the conversation, and people, jumping to the conclusion that, they must have done a deal and he must be happening. And you came out with a comment that said, maybe not. Maybe they don't have as much. And you basically said maybe the glass isn't half full in this case. It could be half empty. And I was impressed with the judiciousness and cautiousness of your comments on Flynn. Could you share them with the audience?
Sure. I don't think I used the metaphor of the glass half empty or half full.
That was my metaphor.
But I'm with I think George Carlin once said, I don't see a glass that's half empty or half full. I see a glass that's twice as big as it needs to be. No, look, just speaking with a caveat, I don't know what Bob Mueller has going on in his office. I only know what you all know and what I read in the papers and what I read when I read the documents that get filed in court. I have some basis to engage in semi-intelligent conjecture based on the fact that I used to do this stuff for a living, and I know some of the participants, and I know Bob Mueller for a long time. And I know it makes common sense if you want to prove something in court in what seems to be strategically sound or not. But my caveat is I don't really know what they're doing. My second caveat is that this is an unusual case. It, in fact, has no precedent that I'm aware of. It's not even like Whitewater, given all the circumstances and the dynamic on the part of the president and other folks. So the standard playbook that an ordinary prosecutor in an ordinary case, use the example of someone on Wall Street, this is not that.
Right.
And there may be considerations that relate to not wanting to have a cloud hang over various people who have not been charged yet or may not be charged. There also, I think, is an urge to speed. You always have that, but even more so because this cloud is hanging. And a need and a desire, I think, to make sure that everything you do is seen with legitimacy, so that ultimately the decisions you make are thought of as authoritative and can be credible. So there's 100 caveats. But what I'll say, the point I was making on the special podcast was that I don't fully buy this idea that I've heard a lot of people say that the mere fact that Michael Flynn has pled guilty to a very narrow charge, a violation of 18 U.S.C. 1001, false statements to the FBI, that the fact of that, combined with unsubstantiated reports that Bob Mueller could charge and convict Michael Flynn of other crimes, that those two facts alone mean that Michael Flynn must be in a position to absolutely drop the bomb on all sorts of other people and will testify against them, and yet he got some sweetheart deal and will not have to plead guilty to anything else again. That doesn't make a ton of sense to me. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but I am saying that it is also possible, and I know a lot of people who don't like Donald Trump don't want to hear this, but just speaking as a lawyer, not as someone who has a political preference, the first option is what I've just described, that he got a sweetheart deal and his information was so great, they let him plead guilty to something fairly minor, and they gave him a pass on everything else. The second option that has to be considered seriously is that is all that Mueller may actually have. And that disappoints a lot of folks. But in considering the Logan Act, which I don't think is not really viable in this circumstance, in considering other false statements he may have made, in considering violations of the false, the obligation to register, in considering a potential quid pro quo with respect to Turkey, I'm saying you have to consider the real possibility that the reason that Michael Flynn was not required at this time to plead guilty to those other things that people speculate about is because they are not chargeable, right? And that's not what I hear people largely on television saying. I think there's a third option, that at this moment, because of the nature of the case and because they may not be prepared to proceed against other people, that Michael Flynn may in the future have to take some responsibility for other crimes and that other people may be charged. And it's happening in stages. That's not the usual way. I don't remember ever doing it that way, but this is an unusual case. It's an unusual time. These are unusual targets. But the idea that there's going to come a time, this is the basic point, just again, I could be totally wrong. As I said in my podcast this morning, as my family reminds me every day, I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. But I'm on a stage, and so I got to say something. The ultimate point is just this. I don't see a way that you're going to see Michael Flynn in the future taking the witness stand against other people higher up on the food chain, testifying that those other people engaged in crimes that he himself participated in, and that he did not take legal responsibility in a guilty plea for those crimes. I don't see that, because that, as a witness, as a strategic matter in court, your witness gets killed, because the only thing they're going to know about him right now is that he got a sweetheart deal, and the one thing you know that he admitted to is that he's a liar, and he lied in a law enforcement proceeding, which a trial kind of is. That's all.
Thank you. Preet, one of the things that we're here today and we're going to be discussing for the next hour and a half is whether or not our core, I guess, American civitas is under such stress. The system of checks and balances, our institutions that kind of make American democracy work. And that just goes through every institution. You can think about finance, you can think about science, you can think about the media, Congress. And I know you played such a vital role in the law and order side of it, but now as a citizen looking at the component pieces and how they're interacting, how would you grade the different players and how they're doing in this moment?
Look, I think there's a lot to be concerned about, and people go back and forth on how concerned we should be. But if you look at the basic checking and balancing institutions in the country, we should be concerned about all of them. But I think that with respect to the press, which is not a branch of government, even though they sometimes think they are, but they are referred to in the Constitution in that First Amendment, I think the press is pretty robust. And there's lots of discussion of fake news, and the president loves to mock particular reporters and particular news outlets and loves to talk about fake news. That's not good. That's kind of bad. But structurally, under the Constitution, I don't see anybody repealing the First Amendment. I don't see anybody, in any way that could be successful, change the laws of libel. And so we're also seeing, I think, a renaissance of reporting to some degree on the part of a lot of the major news outlets and even the news outlets that are not considered major. So I think that the freedom of the press is pretty robust, even though you have someone in the White House who denigrates some outlets from time to time. Among the three branches of government otherwise, the courts, I think, are also pretty strong for structural reasons. You have, if you're a judge, it may be terrible and upsetting and not wonderful if the President of the United States disagrees with one of your rulings and mocks you on Twitter or in interviews and denigrates you in some way, but you have life tenure and you go about the independent job of doing your work. If you're a U.S. attorney and the president doesn't like you, you get a podcast. If you're a judge, you maintain your position in your job, and I think the judges have, been holding up their end of the bargain under the Constitution. Congress, I think, is a mixed bag. Congress is the political branch, and it's supposed to have not only a function of enacting legislation, and I worked in the United States Senate for 4.5 years as a staffer, to enact legislation, but also has an oversight function. And sometimes that oversight function is exerted aggressively and robustly, and sometimes it's not. I would give it sort of a mixed grade at this point. The willingness of the Congress to be a tough enforcer of its own constitutional authority as one branch of government and chuck another branch, the executive branch, depends on who's up and who's down. It depends on the ratings of the president. It depends on what other kinds of things people want to get accomplished. It depends on what the ratio of Democrats to Republicans in and who has power. And depending on how things are going, I think they do sometimes a noble job. I think you've seen some senators who have said things like country over party, and you have people like Ben Sass and Bob Corker and John McCain and others who I think are taking stands that would be unusual and I think more partisan in prior times. So I think in the congressional sense, I'm not sure. My greatest concern is on the part of the norms that are being trampled in the executive branch itself. And one of the things we have to be concerned about is not whether or not the Constitution is doing a good job, but there are all these areas of discretion. I mean, someone put it on my podcast recently. We kind of govern through an honor code, and lots and lots of people are now finding, further to the point, I think, of your evening today, are finding out that democracy works not only because of provisions in the Constitution, not only because of provisions in Title 18 of the Criminal Code, not only because of things that lawyers write down on pieces of paper, but because the people who inhabit important positions, whether it's a United States Attorney, an Attorney General, an FBI Director, or a President and his staff, observe certain norms, not because they're merely a tradition,
right,
but because they're steeped in what people have found in governance is good for the country, is good for freedom, is good for justice. And this president is trampling a lot of those things. Sure, you can call people up and tell them to back off on an investigation up to a point short of obstruction, but that's not good for democracy. And my worry is the trampling of issues of relating to conflicts of interest, the independence of the FBI, the independence of the Justice Department. That's where my concern lies in the greatest respect.
When you see the president take on and challenge and disrupt institutions like the FBI and the CIA, critical institutions involved with national security and domestic security. Do you think that that is fixable? How do you put the genie back in the bottle?
Yeah, look, I think like anything else, what you really want is the institution that is under attack to assert itself and defend itself. Like I think, for example, the press has the benefit of this amendment that I mentioned, and the courts have the benefit of the constitutional provisions relating to them as well. But there are also ways for institutions like the FBI, as I think evidenced by what I only saw snippets of it, but Chris Wray, who I think is an honorable person and a good person, in the face of the things that Donald Trump was saying that I think are egregious and unhelpful and slightly silly about his own FBI and his own intelligence community, Chris Wray sent an internal email to the department, to the Bureau, saying how much he was proud of the work that they do and the mission that they're involved with, and said the same thing under questioning from a lot of people. No institution is perfect. No institution should be lionized in a particular way. That's true of the armed forces. It's also true of domestic law enforcement agencies. But there are things to do like that and assert your independence and, I don't know, arguably not take a phone call from the president when you think it's inappropriate to do so. I would have liked to hear Jeff Sessions, who's the Attorney General of the United States, say something about the goodness of the FBI and how their independence and integrity, which he has not. So, glass half full. Chris Wray says good things.
Wait for that metaphor on his next podcast.
Glass half empty. Such an original one. Glass half empty. The Attorney General doesn't say anything. But I think it takes, just like you're seeing in the Senate, and you're seeing people, I think, engage in some courageous conduct. Not all the people on the left think this when they see a Republican senator, send a $100 check, like Jeff Flake from Arizona, to the Democratic nominee for Senate in Alabama. I think anytime somebody of a particular party who is always expected to be partisan does something, no matter how small, that is not knee-jerk and that is not fully consonant with what the sort of partisan bosses in their politically, their political affiliation want them to do, that is something to be celebrated. And I think when, an FBI director does it and says, you know what, I know you said this thing, right, but we have our own traditions and institutions also, and I'm going to protect it, because look, at the end of the day, it's the rank and file people at these institutions that make government work. Chris Wray I didn't do a case. My people did the cases, and they counted on me to be a leader and a face of the office, to give them the support that they need, to have their back, to protect them against intrusions from other people. And sometimes, in my case, it was from the Department of Justice, Maine Justice, and other districts, or nonsense political interference. And if you have people doing that, that's how you minimize the damage. And then when you have some years go by, and you have somebody who respects those institutions again, right, the work of repair, I think, becomes easier and fuller.
Right. Finally, Preet, thank you so much for your candor and thoughtful answers. We have a lot of conscientious Americans in the room, a lot of people watching online. Just short form, as you're a now citizen, what advice do you have people in a stressed out time to be conscientiously engaging in these subjects? What can they do constructively?
You should come to events like this. Look, I think people should be engaged. I made the point once recently that, it would seem, given all the histrionics about the election and how much people cared and how much protest there was and how much coverage there was, that the last election would have seen the greatest participation in the history of the country. And I think participation was the lowest it's been, I don't know if I have this exactly right, but in 20 years. The antidote, if you care about things, to not having the country go in the direction you don't want it to go, is to use your voice, to use your vote, to use your convening authority. And the other point I'd make related to this, when I do events and I get asked questions a lot from people who don't like the direction of the country, and they don't like the president that's sitting in the Oval Office. And that's true of, I think, a majority of people in the country, if you believe the polls. But then I get questions like, could you explain the process by which the president could be removed under the 25th Amendment, which is the never invoked part of the Constitution, where if the president is unable to carry on his duties, there can be a system in place, and he can, or how does impeachment work? And I get those questions, and they come from a position of people wanting a different person there. So another way of answering your question is, I don't think that's that useful to ruminate on and wish for, Deus Ex Machina to come down in the form of the 25th Amendment, or a Senate that's going to convict the president when it probably will still have a majority if, in the unlikely scenario, the Democrats both take back the House and also vote articles of impeachment, et cetera, et cetera. That's still several years down the road. If you care about these things, further to your question, then I would spend less time thinking about the 25th Amendment, more time talking to your colleagues, figuring out ways that you can be active in the community, persuading people who are not of your point of view to your point of view, and having people who do have your point of view participate, get engaged, vote, organize, protest to the side you want. And I say that, by the way, that's true of Republicans and Democrats. If you have a view about things, don't expect magic to do the work for you. You have to do the work for yourself.
Ladies and gentlemen, Preet Bharara, thank you very, very much for joining us.